Good evening. My name is Matthew Phillips. I'm a professor of practice in law and ethics here in the business school and the associate dean of our MBA programs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this presentation sponsored by the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism. In southeastern Connecticut, overlooking the Thames River, and I'm told that Thames, while wrong in the global sense, is correct in this local context, but I'm from a city that has a neighborhood called Buena Vista, so I can't really judge. In any case, the Civil War era Fort Trumbull stands looking toward Long Island Sound. The fort is strong but humble, as if even the structure acknowledges that it sits on the site of a dramatic Revolutionary War loss, one of Benedict Arnold's traitorous victories, but has served nobly as well, including a stint as the home of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. On the landward side of the fort is about 20 acres of overgrown grass. This vista tells a similar story. Despite a noble effort, it became the site of one of the most significant losses in American legal history. This former neighborhood is the subject of the infamous U.S. Supreme Court decision in Kelo versus New London. Though technically a loss for Mrs. Kelo and the property rights activists, the court's decision in Kelo led to a renewed conversation in our society about the strength and integrity of private property rights. Standing at the bar during Supreme Court arguments and at the center of the ensuing conversation around the country was Scott Bullock. Mr. Bullock represented Suzette Kelo and the other residents of Fort Trumbull in one of the most heated oral argument sessions before the court in years, presaging the heated arguments that followed around the country in the wake of the decision. Former Wake Forest professor John Allison, then the CEO of BB&T, announced his bank would no longer lend money in development projects where eminent domain was used. States and municipalities rewrote their eminent domain law to tighten requirements and prevent this kind of takeover in the future. Bullock has argued in other cases for economic freedom, including the case of the monks of St. Joseph Abbey who won the right to continue selling their handmade wooden caskets despite state regulation. Recently, he's spoken out about the dangers of civil forfeiture and other violations of traditional notions of private property and due process. He's written in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and has been featured guest on 60 Minutes, the ABC Nightly News, and National Public Radio, among others. On behalf of the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism and the Wake Forest School of Business, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Scott Bullock. Please join me in welcoming him to Farrell Hall for today's lecture.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and it's a real pleasure to be here at Wake Forest to talk to you a little bit about private property rights and really what happens when private property rights are given short shrift under the U.S. Constitution. Because when you think of the Constitution and constitutional rights, people often think of things like the right to free speech, the right to vote. Those are all important constitutional freedoms. But side by side with those, and equally important, is the right to own and use private property. And those references to property are throughout the Constitution, and especially in the Bill of Rights. One of the most prominent ones being, and I want to just start off with a little bit of constitutional text here, is the Fifth Amendment. So the Fifth Amendment is well known. If you've ever been in trouble before, you can say, I'm going to invoke my Fifth Amendment right not to say anything. That's the right against self-incrimination. The government can't force you to testify against yourself. That's why criminal defendants sometimes, you will see, or oftentimes, don't take the stand, because that is a part of the Fifth Amendment. But there's other parts of the Fifth Amendment that are also there and are just as important. And one of them is the Due Process Clause, which says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So the founders were equating liberty and people's life with property, that they're all equally worthy of protection under the Constitution. And then another part of the Fifth Amendment, this is the last line, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Another important protection for private property rights. But unfortunately, in the past several decades, courts have undermined the protection for private property rights. They've been given really second-class status under the Constitution. And you have then seen, in the wake of that lack of protection by the courts, abuses of private property rights by federal, state, and local government officials. And I want to focus in my remarks tonight on two of what I consider to be the gravest threats to private property rights in America today, although there are, of course, several other ones as well. And I want to use them as illustrations of what happens when property rights are undermined by the court. And the one I want to talk about first focuses on that last section of the Fifth Amendment there that's generally called the Takings Clause of the Constitution. And what we're talking about here is the power of eminent domain. This is the ability of government to take your home, your business, your land. It is one of the most serious things that a government can do to its citizens. Apart from putting you in jail or perhaps killing you, this is about the most serious thing that the government can do, to deprive you of your home, to deprive you of your business. And the founders were so concerned about the potential abuse of that power that they wrote the Takings Clause. Now recognize that the founders did recognize that the government could take your property, but only under two circumstances and two limitations there. The government can take your property, but they have to pay you for it. That's just compensation. So the government just can't come and confiscate your property and leave you with nothing. They have to pay you for it. Now, there's a whole debate about what constitutes just compensation, but there's an even more important provision in the Takings Clause, and that's the Public Use Clause. That says the government can only take your property, even if they pay you for it, if it is for a public use. Now, throughout most of American history, it was recognized as to what those public uses are. And it's what most people would think of: a road, a public park, a public utility. Those are public uses, basically public projects that folks, with either the public or the government, would own, or everybody would have the ability to use by the public. So that was the law for a number of years. There were some exceptions to that. Sometimes governments tried to expand that, but that was generally the law for most of the nation's history. Well, that started changing in the 1950s. And it was around the time that courts started to undermine protections for private property rights. And what happened during that time, and I don't have time to get into all the history of it, but there were efforts underway in many cities to revive urban areas, to do at that time what was called urban renewal. And the idea was that the cities were in bad shape, we have to revitalize the cities, we have to improve them, and so therefore we will engage in what was then called urban renewal projects. Now those oftentimes turned out to be total disasters for the people that lived there, and that they never really lived up to the expectations that people had thought. But that was the idea, is that we were going to do these wonderful urban renewal projects. So there was a problem with this, though, because what the government wanted to do was to take property from certain private property owners and hand them over to other private property owners. Basically people that were supposed to revitalize the cities. So this was attempted, and there was a problem, and it was the public use provision of the Takings Clause. Well, it's saying taking property from one private owner and handing it over to another private owner sounds like private use, not public use. So the court said, well, let's read the language of the Constitution broadly. And yes, it says public purpose, or excuse me, public use, but why don't we read that to mean public purpose? And our public purpose is to revitalize our cities, to engage in urban renewal, to do all these wonderful things. And the court signed off on that. And so starting in the 1950s and for several decades after that, governments started to engage in these urban renewal projects, started to take property from one private owner and hand it over to another private owner as well. And because the courts had expanded public use to mean public purpose, then they started talking about, well, if public use means public purpose, why doesn't it mean public benefits as well? And that takes us to what happened in the case of Kelo versus the City of New London. So Suzette Kelo owned a little pink house in New London, Connecticut. There it is, right there. Tiny place. It's a Victorian home in an old neighborhood, as was said in the introduction to it. It has a beautiful view of the river. It had been in this neighborhood, these homes have been there since the 1890s or so. But New London was a down-on-the-heels community, and they had a project in mind. And it turns out that that building to the left of the house over there was going to be the new global headquarters for Pfizer. Pfizer moved in next door to the Fort Trumbull neighborhood, and the city and developers said, well, wouldn't it be nice to have development projects which complemented our new research headquarters here in New London? So why don't we have a 5-star luxury hotel, upscale condominiums, private office space? That would revitalize our city. That was the argument that they were making. And they said, well, this isn't really a blighted neighborhood. This is actually, the homes are modest, they're working class, but so we're not even going to say that the public purpose is urban renewal. We're going to say that there are going to be public benefits that are going to flow from this new development project. What are those benefits? More tax revenue, more jobs, greater economic growth. That was the justification for the use of eminent domain. Well, there's a problem with that. There were people that lived in those homes. There were people that valued those homes. One of them was Suzette Kelo. She had bought this house about a year before the development project was put into place. She had made it her own. It was the first piece of property she had ever owned in her entire life. And she was not interested in selling her little pink house. So she said, this is not a public use. You're just taking my land to give to other private parties. How could that be justified under the Constitution? And an important part with Suzette as well, and it shows why it's so important to follow the Constitution, is that Suzette wasn't interested in money. One of the benefits of private property is the fact that it becomes home ownership is one of the greatest assets that you have. It's one of the most important values monetarily in your life. But Suzette didn't really want to sell. This place was special to her. She bought it, she owned it, she fixed it up, she painted it her favorite color. It was really her home, and she was not interested in selling. It wasn't a matter of, well, if you give me $50,000 more, $100,000 more, I'll move. She did not want to move, period. This was her home, this was her property. And that's why the takings clause doesn't say, nor shall private property be taken without just compensation. It says that the government has to have a really good reason, a public use, before they can do something like take away Suzette Kelo's little pink house. So that issue went up before the Supreme Court. And as was said in the introduction, a very controversial 5-4 decision. The Supreme Court upheld this taking of Suzette Kelo's little pink house. And the court ruled that, well, yes, public use, it says public use, but for at least the past 60 years, we've interpreted that language very broadly to mean public purpose, and why can't this mean public benefit? This new project is going to create more tax revenue, and the city had projected that we're going to create over $1 million in tax revenue a year out of this project, and we're going to create hundreds of new jobs due to the development that's in this area. And so we're going to gain public benefits from this. Well, this is really a vision of eminent domain without any sort of limitation whatsoever. Because every home would produce more tax revenue and jobs if it were a business. Every smaller business would produce more tax revenue and jobs if it were a larger business. And that is what the court was really signing off on. And remember, all you have to do is project what that new job growth and what that new tax revenue would be. But projections are oftentimes wrong. And that's exactly what happened, as was alluded to in the introduction. 10 years now after the Supreme Court's decision in the Kelo case, over $80 million in tax revenue spent to do this project. This is what is there right now. It is a barren field filled with construction debris, but they do have new residents. A community of feral cats has set up home there in the community. They are taking advantage of this. But the development project fell through the way many development projects do. So the city gained no new tax revenue, no new jobs, and the state of Connecticut was out $80 million as a result of this, but the precedent was set. So that's the bad news about what happened in the Kelo case. I want to turn just briefly to the good news about it before turning to this other threat, because what had happened in the wake of Kelo was the most significant backlash against the Supreme Court's decision in recent memory. You guys were probably pretty young when this happened. It was 10 years ago, but it was one of those decisions that just shocked people. People could not believe this, that the court would sign off on something like this. And it was a decision that hit home, if I can pull that back there, for really everybody in the country. People looked at that home and said, well, that's the home I grew up in, or that's my grandmother's home. It really resonated with people in a way that some Supreme Court decisions really don't do. And people just could not believe that the court would sign off on something like this. They thought, well, surely the Supreme Court would put a stop to this. It just seemed wrong in principle. And if people knew anything about the Constitution, there is this provision in there that said it should only be taken for a public use. So it really enraged people, and it led to this very significant backlash, where now over 40 states have changed their laws to better protect property owners. Many state Supreme Courts have gone in the opposite direction as the U.S. Supreme Court under their own state constitutions, which is a very promising thing to see. And people were just inflamed about this and were able then to better protect their property rights as a result of this very bad decision by the Supreme Court. We're confident that it's a decision that one day will be overturned, that the court will recognize that they made a terrible error in deciding the Kelo case. But what's so encouraging about this is the fact that there has been this significant progress and even a renewed respect and appreciation for private property rights as a result of the court's decision in the Kelo case. So let me turn a little bit to talk about this other threat to private property rights that you might not be as familiar with, but again, it demonstrates what happens when the government does not, and where courts do not recognize protections for private property rights. Have any of you heard of civil forfeiture? You know what it is? No, she has. Anybody else? So civil forfeiture is the idea, not even the idea, the power of the government to take your home, your cash, your car, your business, without ever charging or even convicting you of a crime. I'm serious. This is what can happen. The government can take away your cash, your car, your home, your business, without charging or even convicting you of a crime. This is very different than something that's called criminal forfeiture. The criminal forfeiture is a power that people get, you know, like Bernie Madoff, the great embezzler of Wall Street. He was found pled guilty to embezzling people out of their money, and then the government was able to come in and take all of the yachts and cars and mansions that he bought with the embezzled funds. That's because he was convicted of a crime. In civil forfeiture, you do not have to be charged with a crime. It's that your property was involved in illegal activity. So because your property was involved in illegal activity, the government can confiscate it from you. And one of the odd aspects of civil forfeiture is that when the government files a case against not you as a property owner, but against your property. So civil forfeiture cases have such names as State of Texas versus 2004 Chevrolet Silverado. Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus $2,600 in US currency. Or a case that we litigated, it was called United States of America versus 434 Main Street, Tewksbury, Massachusetts. And this is a case that I think really demonstrates just about everything that is wrong with civil forfeiture and why it is such an assault on private property rights. I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about this man in the picture here. That's not Walter Matthau, although it looks like if you know the actor. That's Russ Caswell. He owns the Motel Caswell outside Tewksbury, is almost on the border of New Hampshire. It's near Lowell, Massachusetts. And the Motel Caswell is a budget motel. It's the cheapest room in town. It's been owned by the Caswell family since the 1950s, where his father bought the land and built the Motel Caswell on it. Russ bought it from his father in the 1980s, and he's been running the place ever since then. He lives right next door to the motel with his family. And it's been there, as I said, for several decades, and it struggles with, as many budget motels do, a certain level of crime. There's crime that occurs at the motel. There's problems with prostitution, sometimes people fighting, people drinking too much, and there's a problem with drug use or drug dealing and drug use out of the motel. So what happened to Russ is that the government never made any allegation against Russ that he himself was involved in drug use or drug dealing. But what the government said was, Russ, your property was involved in drug dealing. People at your motel used and sometimes sold drugs out of your motel. And so on that basis, because your property was used to facilitate this illegal activity, we are going to forfeit your property. So the government filed an action against his property called United States of America versus 434 Main Street in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, the address of the motel. And their theory was, under civil forfeiture, is that it doesn't matter whether you're guilty or innocent of any wrongdoing. Your property was used to facilitate crime, therefore we are allowed to take it. And now the interesting thing about this is that there were other budget motels in the area that had very similar, if not identical, problems. The Motel 6, same type of issues. The Fairfield Inn, right down the road, same type of issues. But what distinguished Russ Caswell's motel from the rest of those, which is another important aspect for understanding what is happening in civil forfeiture? Russ's property is a family-owned motel. And because it's been in the family for so long, it is mortgage-free. Now, why should and I bet you the Motel 6 is not family-owned, it's corporate-owned, and I bet it has some mortgage and other type of secured loans taken out on the property. Now, why is this significant? Why would the government go after Russ's motel using civil forfeiture laws and not the Motel 6 or the Fairfield Inn? Well, under civil forfeiture, and this is another lesson about government behavior is that the police and prosecutors get to keep all of the property that they forfeit for their own use. So the government and the law enforcement agencies were able to take Russ's motel and sell it, and because it was a large piece of property on a commercial strip, it was worth over $1.5 million. All of that money would go back to the very people that are out there enforcing the law. Now, if they had to deal with the Motel 6, they would probably have to deal with the banks and the corporate lawyers that would go in and try to fight them on this. But with Russ's motel, they were able to get the property free and clear. And this is one of the fundamental problems with civil forfeiture, is it allows the government to take property and profit from its use. And you're giving government officials a direct financial stake in the outcome of civil forfeiture. And this was permitted back in the 1980s. And it was another example, as you see, of private property rights protection being eroded. For a number of years, civil forfeiture wasn't even really used in the law. It was a backwater. It was used in very limited circumstances, like in maritime cases, cases involving the high seas. But in the 1980s, where Congress was expanding the federal government's power, and a lot of state and local governments followed suit when the war on drugs was being ramped up, they also then changed the incentive structure in civil forfeiture. In 1985, the law was changed. Before that time, all civil forfeiture revenue had to go to the general fund of the Treasury. So if any forfeiture revenue was created, it went back to the general Treasury, and then Congress and elected officials decided how to use it. The law was changed to put this profit incentive into the law in 1985 that then said, if you are prosecuting this and taking property, then you get to keep everything that you take for your own use. Guess what happened when that incentive was put into the law? Forfeiture revenue skyrocketed, and it's been going up ever since that time. Before the incentive was put into place, the fund had approximately about $70 million in it. The federal fund alone, in the last fiscal year, topped $4 billion. And that's just at the federal level alone. Many state and local governments have very similar laws, and you're seeing people who are not guilty of any wrongdoing that are still having their property confiscated. It's motel owners like Russ, it's homeowners, and it's also people on our nation's highways as well. You know, it is not a good idea right now to carry cash on you if you're traveling on the highway right now. Because a common question that is asked now on the highway, if you're pulled over, is, of course, driver's license and registration. Do you know why I pulled you over? And oftentimes, especially if you are in any way suspicious or maybe meet a certain profile, a question that is asked is, are you carrying any large amounts of cash on you today? And if the answer is yes, and they find that, it is oftentimes taken from you, because the government will say that we think that you might be dealing drugs, you might be laundering money, we're going to seize the property, and because it's civil forfeiture and no criminal conviction is required, then you have to fight the government in civil court to try to get your property back. And there have been hundreds of millions of dollars that have been taken from folks on highways throughout the country now as a result of this civil forfeiture power that's been granted to government. It's one that's thankfully starting to get some attention. And it's something that we've been focused on at the Institute for Justice in fighting. We put a lot of effort into fighting eminent domain abuse. The Kelo case was our case, and we've been putting a lot of efforts into challenging eminent domain abuse, and we're doing the same thing right now for civil forfeiture in order to fight this egregious abuse of private property rights. As I said, thankfully, it's starting to get some attention. There's been a lot of media interest in this story. The Washington Post ran a series, an investigative series that documented what is happening in civil forfeiture. There's been renewed interest on the part of lawmakers, and if you haven't seen it yet, I would encourage you. You guys know John Oliver on HBO? The last week tonight he starts his show just about every week with about a 15-minute rant against something. He did one, I think toward the end of last year, about civil forfeiture, documenting this crazy mixed-up world of civil forfeiture where everything you thought you knew about the Constitution and about criminal proceedings and the like have been flipped upside down, and where property owners are at the mercy of police and prosecutorial officials. So it's something that we're encouraged by, and we hope something that will change, because it's not a power that should exist in a country that's supposed to respect private property rights. At the very least, if the government is going to take your property, criminal proceedings and criminal protection should apply to property owners that find themselves caught up in civil forfeiture proceedings. And most importantly, this profit incentive should be removed from the law. You know, every economist will tell you incentives matter. And if you give people the wrong incentives, if you give them perverse incentives, it's not surprising that they're going to behave in a way that is going to try to maximize the amount of property that they gain. The more property they gain, the more benefits that flow to their agencies. And this isn't a matter of just a couple of bad prosecutors or bad cops. If you give people the wrong incentives, they will respond accordingly. And rather than somebody saying, well, let's crack open the cold case file and check to see if we can solve any of these crimes here, or let's investigate something that might take a big effort and there might not be a big payoff for it, or we could go out and focus on activities that will generate revenue for our agency and make our lives better and our jobs more secure. It should not be surprising that you see so many of these efforts turn toward then focusing on trying to take property away from people who are not even, as I said, charged and certainly not convicted of a crime. Ideally, though, civil forfeiture should simply be abolished. No one in America should lose their property without being convicted of a crime. And certainly police and prosecutors should not profit from those activities. So we are trying, through our work in protection of private property rights, to stop eminent domain abuse and to stop civil forfeiture from happening. There's been great progress that's been made on the fight against eminent domain abuse, and we're starting to see some real efforts and real momentum against the fight on civil forfeiture as well. One thing you have to realize, though, is that these battles are never entirely won, because what's happening with eminent domain right now is that the Kelo case was handed down, you had public outrage that built about it, you had laws that were passed by legislatures, you had a lot of developers and governments back off of it, but now, 10 years later, memories are fading, the commercial real estate market is coming back, and you're starting to see city officials, developers start talking about then going after people's homes and businesses in the name of greater economic development and trying to increase the tax base of a particular community. So we have to stay on guard against this, but the landscape is so much better than what it was even before the Kelo decision, and it's something that hopefully people will remain vigilant on and to protect private property rights. And civil forfeiture is one of those instances where opposition is being built about it, awareness is growing, and it's like what's happened with eminent domain. When people hear about it, they can't believe that it's happening. And please believe it, learn a little bit more about it, and speak out against this as well. Good news is, though, that because it's seen as such an abuse, folks, once they understand it, are opposed to it. And that's very encouraging as well. So why don't I close there with my talk about eminent domain abuse and civil forfeiture, open it up to any questions you might have about this or any other topic. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions?
Test. Okay.
Yeah,
Hi there. Thanks for speaking with us today.
absolutely.
I agree with you. I think the burden of proof should be on the government to convict someone if they're going to take their property. But you know, if someone's pleading the ignorance where they didn't know that this was occurring on their property, where would you draw the line?
Yep. Well, I mean, this is something that you have to, this is what was an issue in the Caswell case as well, because what he demonstrated is that he always helped the police, and he always tried to do what he could to stop the events from occurring. And if the government was truly interested in trying to stop the activity that was occurring there, the low-level drug use and drug dealing as well, then they should have turned to him and said, hey, listen, we've got a real problem here. Let's work together with this and try to see if we can address it. They never did that. They never once came to him about it. And there's other things that the government can do if you are told about problems on your property and you just don't do anything about it. There's nuisance laws, there's things like that that deal with real issues with it. And the fact that they didn't do that, they immediately went and tried to take his property, showed that what was really going on here was a desire for revenue as opposed to a real serious concern about crime. I should say, too, that we were able to represent Russ, and we won. And we fought back against it, and it was for some of those very reasons that we were able to demonstrate that he had no prior knowledge of this, and he actually took steps to try to protect his property from this type of activity, and yet the government still tried to forfeit his property. So we were able to succeed on that. The problem with civil forfeiture, what's the problem with so many disputes with the government, is that most property owners cannot afford to fight this. You know, if the government takes $5,000 from you, well, you know, a lawyer doesn't even crack open a book for under $5,000 if you're going to hire a lawyer in private practice. So it's a huge club that the government has against the citizens. And what typically happens in those instances, that people end up settling cases, and so they maybe get half their money back, or you know, as the government offered to Russ to, you know, sell the hotel, and they'd give him some of his money back for it. And so that's a real weapon they should have. I should also mention, too, with civil forfeiture, that makes it in some ways even more outrageous than eminent domain, is that at least in eminent domain, you get paid something for your property. You know, and oftentimes it's not just compensation, it's the appraised value of your property with it. But in civil forfeiture, you get paid nothing. So if that motel was taken and sold, Russ would have lost everything that he had worked for his entire life. And so that's what makes it even more, I think, outrageous, and the deprivation of private property rights is even more severe. Yeah. Any other questions?
Okay, so in this one case, you were able to prove that the government was incentivized for revenue.
Yep.
But do you think this case is unique, or do you think most of these civil fortitude cases are like this?
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not unique. I mean, there's many instances of this, and of course, you know, they're never going to come out and say that, you know, all the reason why we did this is because we wanted this money. They'll say, well, we're just trying to stop this from occurring at the property, and you know, to shut down this bad motel. But the fact that they targeted this when there were even more problematic properties in the area, think it's a pretty clear indication as to what was really going on in this case, is that they were looking for a property that was family owned, that didn't have the corporate interest, because if it's corporate owned, then of course you're going to have big law firms that are going to come in and try to fight it. The property is probably going to be secured in some way for it. So it's oftentimes hard to tell the motivations of government officials when they act. But it's pretty clear, especially when the amount of money that's being generated and the focus that government is putting on civil forfeiture for it. It's a problem, across the board. This also happened in the Kelo case as well. This is something where, and this was an issue in the case because, we had said, well, listen, it looks like that the government is doing this and the private properties are involved in this is because Pfizer moved in next door, and New London really wants to please Pfizer. And they put together a development project next door that seemed to be exactly what Pfizer wanted in their, for their own purposes as well. But you don't know what's going on in the hearts and minds of city officials. And they said, oh, no, this has nothing to do with Pfizer. It has nothing to do with development. We're just trying to benefit the community through higher taxes and more jobs. And oftentimes what happens, of course, is when people act like this, it's a mixed motivation. They might be doing it partly for a private interest and maybe also because they think it's good for the community. Most people think whatever's good for them is also good for the community as well. So it's one of the reasons why bright lines need to be drawn in these instances. So you don't get into situations where it's a debate as to what the true motivations are behind people and how they act. Government should just take property when it's for a true public use. That's a pretty clear definition of what it is, rather than for a private use, and then you have to debate, well, how private is it? Are they doing it really for public reasons or for private reasons? When it's simply for a public use, then you can avoid some of those things and end up protecting private property too. Let somebody else. Yep.
Thanks. Hi, thanks again for coming. My name is Joe Cernelli. I'm in the full-time MBA program, and I have about 6-8 weeks of military law training, but I'm
Yep.
curious but not knowledgeable. I'm curious how did the legal steps and the legal proceeding or precedents build up such that there could be legal or criminal actions instigated by the government against non-persons? Like,
Yeah.
how did we get to that point? Could you talk a little bit about what led up to
Yeah. So I skipped over a little bit of that because it's because it is based in some ways on history, and you see this drift occur. Like I was talking about with eminent domain too, where it was originally public use, and then it became public purpose, and then eventually it became public benefit. And what had happened with civil forfeiture is that it was this was kind of an ancient concept. This idea of inanimate objects doing something as well. And so it was a medieval concept. The knight was riding through the forest. He smacks his head on a tree branch, and he dies. And then, of course, the knight didn't make a mistake and wasn't an idiot. The tree killed the knight. So we must cut down the offending tree and get rid of the property for it. So it's kind of this ancient doctrine that existed where inanimate objects were somehow thinking and acting. But that wasn't the tradition in America. America didn't import a lot of these kind of European notions. American law was came from British law. And so British law had this idea that in certain instances, like in admiralty cases and customs cases, early federal government, almost all the revenue from the government came from the enforcement of customs laws, paying duties on imported goods and that sort of thing. Federal government had no income tax. This is largely how they collected the revenue for it. Well, there's a problem with that because the owner of the property might not be in the country. So there was he might be in another country. He could be out on the high seas somewhere. So it was tough for a court to bring this owner of the goods that wasn't paying the tax into court. So they said, well, we'll recognize a remedy in those instances and if the tax isn't paid, we can confiscate the property for it. So that was kind of the origin for it. It was based upon the fact that they weren't able to get jurisdiction over the person, and that's largely for a number of years where it was confined to. And then it was expanded a little bit during Prohibition, because with cars that were transporting liquor, they then would sometimes go after the car with it. And then, you know, lawyers can be ingenious, you know, and they can come up with new ways of adopting old powers for it. And that's what happened starting in the 70s and 80s, that they took this power that was very limited in its origins and applied to the case where they couldn't get jurisdiction over a person, and said, well, let's just use it here. It's more convenient. It's easier for us to use civil forfeiture because we don't have to convict somebody. And that's how it kind of grew from that. Again, it was a power that had been around, and it was expanded, and courts were not protecting private property rights as a result. And so that's something that is hopefully changing. Courts are getting much more concerned about this because they're seeing the abuses, they're seeing how much governments are stretching this, and they're seeing more efforts placed upon governments to try to take this property because they want the revenue. You know, times are tough, budgetary shortfalls are there. They want to focus on things where they can actually make some money. Anybody else? Questions for it?
Thank you. Excellent talk. I wanted to talk to you about a local issue. Just north of Winston-Salem, about 20 years ago, the state government decided that they were going to build a beltway called the I-74 Beltway. And under the auspices of the MAP Act, the North Carolina MAP Act, they designated a road corridor that essentially froze the land market. About 2,000 homes are in this road corridor. And to this date, the road's never been built. The people can't get out of their homes. The land market's frozen. Nobody wants to buy these homes. And the state says they don't have any money to build the road, yet there's no timeline to ever build the road. There's no eminent domain that's happening for most of these people. There's no compensation, and it's before the North Carolina Supreme Court. So I wanted to ask you what you thought about whether you thought this would qualify as a takings or where this would fit with the Fifth.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not familiar in particular with that, but the governments can do this even for, now of course, if it was truly built, that would be an example of a traditional public use where the government could take the property because it was for a road. But when you have a situation where the government kind of locks in this provision and there's uncertainty that goes along with it, and it devalues the property, that can sometimes be a taking itself. And that's kind of the flip side of eminent domain. And it's not something that we deal with really, but it's regulatory takings. Remember the takings clause, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. There are certain instances where the government isn't trying to take your property directly. They're not using eminent domain, but they won't let you do anything with it. And you're locked into this, and it devalues the property to the point where it basically can become useless. And the question in those instances, does the government have to pay you for it? That might be what's at issue in this case. And it's almost like the property owners are saying, I'd rather that you take my property and pay me for it, then I at least get something from it, rather than let me keep it and not do anything. It was a famous case in the Supreme Court where somebody had bought 2 beachfront lots, and he was going to build a home for his own use on one and build a home on another one and sell it. And after he had bought the lots, South Carolina passed a law saying, well, you know, we're tired of people, we think there's too much beachfront development, and so we're passing a law saying no more beachfront development anywhere in the state. And so this fellow who owned 2 pieces of this land had the property, and they weren't going to take it from him. They just said, you can't do anything with it. You can have a picnic on it, you can pay taxes on it, but you can't build anything on it. And so that went up before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in an important decision, said that was called a regulatory taking of property. Because even though the government didn't come in and confiscate it, they wouldn't allow you to do anything with your property. It was essentially a taking of your land, and if the government was going to do this, they had to pay you just compensation for it as well. Now, the law on that is pretty limited. North Carolina might be going in a different direction. The courts have essentially said that unless it's something close to 100% of the wipeout of the value of the property, which it was in that case with it, because he literally couldn't do anything with the land except maybe walk on it. Then it has to be close to a complete wipeout, or a complete wipeout, or something close to it as well. But I'll take a look at that case and see what's going on with it. Sweet. Yes.
Okay. We have time for one more.
Hi, I'm Sherry Gerald, teach finance and economics. Your point about Kilo, that look 10 years later, it was blighted, it was overgrown. So in hindsight, it was a bad decision. That adds fuel to the fire that it was a bad decision. But you can't really legislate that way, can you? I think that a more important point is it doesn't matter even if it was booming. It would be harder to argue the point, but on first principles, the point still remains. So it shouldn't matter whether it was successful or not. The point still prevails.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree with that. It is an important point because some people, want to know what works. What can we do with it? And if it did work, then maybe, I have a different attitude about it. And so with certain people, that's a powerful point. I think it does show the fact that oftentimes these projects are failures, and that's the history of it, because they're not market-driven. They're not market-driven projects. It's not usually eminent domain, but it's heavily subsidized then by government officials because they want development to occur in a certain place, and there's nobody that has much skin in the game on it. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, even if it was a booming success, I don't think the ends justifies the means. And that's really what the Constitution is all about. We don't have an ends justifies the means approach in America. You have to follow certain steps with it. I mean, it would be great if, a crime happened in a certain neighborhood. Wouldn't it be, it would solve crime if the police could go into everybody's home instantly and look for who perpetrated the crime. You can't do that. Why? Because we have a Fourth Amendment that says you need to have a good reason to come into somebody's home. You have to have probable cause. You have to have suspicion to do this because we don't want to live in a society where the government can come into your home in any instance for it. We also don't live in a society, hopefully, or at least we shouldn't under the Constitution, that says, well, if we think we have a better idea for using your property than you do, then we have the right to take it, and we'll hope that it works out. Interestingly, in Kilo, we tried to make the point to the court that this development wasn't going to take place because we had good evidence about that it was completely speculative type of development, and it wasn't going to take place. The court didn't really pick up on that because they're concerned about, well, who are we to judge whether or not the development will be a success or not. But it is true that in so many of these cases, and Kilo being Exhibit A in this now, that most of these projects, in addition to abusing people's rights, are just colossal failures as well. I should mention, too, I talked to you about, remember the Pfizer plant that had moved in next door to it that was supposed to, oftentimes people think that the Kilo neighborhood, the Little Pink House, and the rest of the properties there were 15 homes, were being taken for Pfizer. They were not. It was for development that was supposed to complement the Pfizer facility. So Pfizer had started this in the 1990s. Pfizer was booming at that time because they invented, at that moment, a drug that became very popular. Starts with a V. Maybe many of you have heard of it. This was their big profitable drug for them, obviously. Then later on, their fortunes changed. And so what had happened in New London is that they had moved in they built the facility in 2000. They moved in. The city gave them 10-year tax abatement, so they would not pay any taxes for 10 years as an incentive for them to move in. And just as their tax abatement was about to run out, guess what Pfizer did? They closed up shop, left New London forever, said, thanks a lot, we're moving on. So not only did New London not have the development, they lost the company that they thought was going to be their savior. And that's what really happens when you undermine private property, give corporate welfare, and try to skew the marketplace in that way.
On behalf of the BB&T Center, thank you to all of you for coming, and please join me in thanking Mr. Bullock for being with us.
Thanks a lot.